It is impossible to go one day without any major development at political level, economic level, military and social level. And the reason is pretty simple. Africa is a very vibrant community. It's a very vibrant continent. And with most of its people being actually below the age gap of 35 or even 40, it makes sense, to see a lot of, development and movement, across the continent. And today, I'd like to focus on a very interesting country, interesting for many reasons. Well, first, in 2021, he actually experienced another military coup, which actually led to the military junta, seizing power. But the particularity of this country is that, unlike what happened in Mali, Guinea, and Burkina Faso, this country did not cut ties with the ECOWAS. Although this country was also, sanctioned by the ECOWAS, it had, multiple reasons to actually isolate from the West African, economic bloc. It did actually decide to take another road. And this new road that they decided to take led to the recent, drafting of the constitution. And today I want to talk about Guinea-Conakry. Well, welcome to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African. I'm Philippe S.I.K.A. and as always, it's a pleasure to be with you. You know the drill. If you're not yet a member of our community, it's really easy. All you have to do is just to click on the subscribe button. Also, activate the ring bell so that you don't miss out on the very interesting upcoming episode. Well, let me give you a bit of context so that you will understand my whole analysis. Well, in the introduction, I told you that the country, unfortunately, is no foreign to the concept of military seizing of power. Well, it goes back to the independence era. Well, the first president of the country was called actually S.I.K.A. Touré. And Mr. S.I.K.A. Touré died in office in 1984. And right after his death, a group of army officers staged a coup d'etat, which means that the first president-elect in Guinea was S.I.K.A. Touré. And right after he died, unfortunately, no presidential election, was held. But on the contrary, the country experienced its first military coup, which actually led to the seizing of power from Colonel Lansana Conté, who also died in office. Colonel Conté, remained in power from 1984 to 2008. Can you imagine? We're talking about decades of military reign and decades of military power, which also means that the country has been on a very, thin path when it comes to, experiencing and implementing principle of democracy. Another very interesting fact also is to understand that after the death of General Conté and President Conté at the same time, since he was still a military and also a president, the next ruler of the country was also a military who actually seized power through a coup d'etat. And his name was the famous Captain Moussa Dadis Camara. The reason why I say he was very famous was principally because of all his public statement. He will blatantly accuse developed nations and other African nation, other developing country and emerging country, of doing the most crazy things. It will also accuse them of being responsible for all the poverty, taking and the underdevelopment taking place in Guinea. It would also fiercely combat and also accuse the former regime, which you should remember was a military regime, and it will definitely like try and purge, if I can put it that way, the country from all the people who, according to him, like were responsible for the underdevelopment and the poverty, experienced by many Guineans. And perhaps, like the rationale was, somehow good, but I want you to understand that since 1984, up to 2010, Guinea-Conakry never held a democratic election. Never, ever. And I'm not talking about a context like the one in Gabon, for instance, or even the one in Cote d'Ivoire, or even the one in Cameroon, although these countries had the same president for decades, but at least they tried and they pretend, or they at least they had some election just to actually uphold the principle of democracy and make sure that the president was still emanating from the will of the people. But in the Guinean context, it's completely different. After the death of the first president, the next leaders that actually seized power through violence, forces, and military techniques, which is very, very difficult and very dangerous for such a rich nation, rich in terms of natural resources, but rich also in terms of human capital, to actually put itself, onto the set of economic development. Because economic development, like I always emphasize in my podcast, needs stability. And stability can be provided at many levels. Stability can be provided at political level when you can also offer certainty in terms of political transition. If you cannot offer certainty to your local people and to the international community when it comes to power transition within your country, there's a big risk. You will not be in a position to attract for investment. Another stability that you also need to provide is economic stability. Economic stability to making sure that the people who are investing in your country are investing in a context where you can guarantee that they will be able to work in an environment which is not just politically sure, but also financially sure. They know they can work and collaborate with local banks. They can work and collaborate with local SMEs. Family can wake up one day and decide to create a family business and run a family activity, run a family business. So we need to understand that the reason why people are praising democracy as being one of the safest systems is because of all the certainty that it helps provide. And the certainty is very interesting and very important for any country which is actually setting itself onto the track of development. So coming back to my analysis, I want you to understand that the context in Guinea is very interesting and very specific and very special, because the country, since the independence up to 1984, never had a president-elect. So all the leaders were there because of the muscle. And this situation took a very interesting and very different turn in 2010 when Alpha Conde, became the first, democratically elected president. Alpha Conde became, after Sékou Touré, the second president in Guinea who actually seized power through democratic, process, thanks to election. People voted, people elected him. Although the election, was not without any criticisms, but the point here is that for the first time, after a couple of decades, over 30 years, of military ruling, the country decided to renew its ties with a democratic process, which actually led to the election of President Alpha Conde. Well, once President Alpha Conde seized power, he was then, able and authorized by the Constitution to actually stay in power for a maximum of 10 years, which means from 2010 to 2020, these were the maximum period, for which President Conde, according to democratic rules and according to the Constitution, could remain president of the country. Well, now it gets very interesting because once President Conde seized power, and for the record, President Conde was a fierce, like opponent, of the military, rulers under Dadis Camara, under Lassana Conte. President Alpha Conde was a fierce opponent. He was constantly fighting for the return of democratic rule in Guinea. And it's very important. The reason why I'm stressing this is because we need to understand that we're talking about a person. We're talking about an individual who was familiar with the benefit of democracy. He was also familiar with the cons of democracy, and he fought for the return of a democratic system in a country that has been for decades, under the dominance of force and military rule. And he seized power in 2010 and he remained president until 2020. Now we're talking about election year, and unfortunately, the so-called, proponent of democracy decided that a 10-year tenure was not enough. It needed more years. Perhaps this is a legitimate cause. This is a legitimate argument. As a public figure, as a president of a country or a nation, if you believe that you need more time to implement your strategy, to implement your public policy, to make sure that your constituents get the life they deserve at every stage, at social stage, economic stage, health stage, education stage, and etc., you name it, well, perhaps you may come out there and make a claim saying that you need more time. But the problem here is that we're not talking about your personal family. You are not the head of your family. You are the head of a state, of a democratic nation, or at least of a nation which is trying to renew its ties with democracy. So being in that particular context, it's very tricky and it's very difficult, to see a head of state of a democratic nation, like deciding unilaterally or with the support of even some high authorities in the country to actually decide to modify the constitution and to actually increase the term limitation that was already, like available and put in the constitution. So this kind of attitude and this kind of approach is very delicate. Like I said, especially even in the most advanced democracy, it's very difficult to fathom a scenario in which a head of state, at the end of at the end of his last term, will actually decide to modify the constitution so that it can actually, extend its tenure and do more years and perhaps do more good to the society. Even if you have the best intention at heart, it's very difficult and it's not feasible actually to even consider such a scenario in a well-respected country. But unfortunately, this is what happened in Guinea. President Condé decided to change the constitution and to actually run for a third term in 2020, which he obviously, like win, like he became the president-elect in 2020, which actually set him for another 5 years, which will actually total 15 years as, the president of the new democratic nation of Guinea-Conakry. So in that particular context, remember, I told you the country was very young, in terms of political independence, but also in terms of like being a democratic nation. For decades, they've been under military siege, under military ruling. And only, since 2010 and up to now in 2014, it would have been 14 years for Guinea, being a democratic nation. But unfortunately, like this did not happen. And Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya again decide to, go back to the natural way of doing business. He decided to actually stage a coup, which succeeded in 2021. And thanks to that coup, Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya is currently the chief of the transition in Guinea. But what's very interesting with the Mamadi Doumbouya coup d'etat is that it's a coup that actually took place with the least violence possible, first. But second, it's a coup that took place without the military junta having a transition plan. So the thing here is that we have a group of people seizing power, because of democratic concern. They say that they are fighting for the people. But once they seize power, they literally have no plan, no strategy, no agenda, and they are in no position to offer a specific date in terms of when this transition should actually be happening. And thanks to international pressure, but also thanks to their goodwill, they finally decided to draft a constitution, which actually try to tackle those limitations I just mentioned, try to provide, a specific date, try to also provide a context, a democratic context for the upholding of democratic election. And in the next episode, I will be discussing, the implication of this new constitution, this new draft. I will also be discussing the key takeaways, of this constitution and what it means for the country in terms of, again, political stability and also development prospect. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Thank you for staying tuned and listening to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African, the podcast, the only podcast where strong realities meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.